Kyle Krabs covers the draft for the 33rd team. What's your week been like?
It's been an interesting start this week where you're figuring out who's a part of the testing in the process this year, which feels like I'm not working out with a hamstring issue either, so let me disclose that on the front. But getting a chance to hear from some of the players up here, getting a chance to hear from all the coaches and stuff, kind of get a lay of the land. And now that we're into the testing like we talked about, it kind of feels like, okay, now the dust is settled.
Right.
The process can be the process from here and get in the rhythm of the week a little bit more.
Bring in the data.
Yeah, latest news on the edge is that Mike Green is now not testing. It felt like that ties needed to be broken between these guys, and coming from a data scientist, maybe that's not the way it works, but you got to break the ties somehow, right? What are your thoughts on how this edge kind of glut in the middle of the first round is going to end up going?
Yeah, I think when you have kind of this log jam and different schemes can present different types of players that you're looking for, I think the free agency can be really helpful in getting a little bit more clarity on, okay, who are the teams that really do authentically find themselves in that market in the first round. But then also when you have those ties, more often than not, I think the body of work has shown the big people dictate terms to the smaller people. So the guys that have the length, I think about a guy like Jalen Walker, who I really like his profile, but he is more of like a skill-specific type of player. He came in at 6'1", 243 with 32-inch arms, so like he's not tall, he doesn't have great length. Off-ball linebacker type of background. How do you foil that with Shamar Stewart with prototypical size and length, who's going to run really well and have big-time explosive measures? Same thing with Mykel Williams. I think those prototypes, when teams are projecting, probably will feel a little bit more comfortable with this is a proven body of work off of this body type. So as of right now, with some of the incomplete resumes, that's kind of where my mind goes to try to determine what order they come off on.
Aside from what we'll see on the field in terms of drills and comping players to player, are there any specific numbers that you are looking for more than others? Like, I want to see what this guy runs. That will tell me what I need to know about him in order to finish my eval. Or, are you particularly concerned about any tackles' arm lengths?
Yeah, well, the Will Campbell one will be a big one, right? And that's such a big talking point for a guy that from consensus going back to July and August was widely considered a top 5 player in the class, top offensive lineman. Do you play him at guard? Does he pass the threshold for tackle for some teams? That'll be like the big anatomical measurement. I think that's going to be a big storyline. But I go to the testing on Thursday with Carson Schweschinger, the linebacker. He's the heaviest off-ball linebacker here at 242, and he was on their roster at 225. So I'm really interested to see 10-game starter, but was a former walk-on, unreal instincts for what he does from a processing perspective. Now you went from, we expect you were going to be in the high 220s to being the heaviest off-ball linebacker here in the 240s. How well do you run? Because if he ends up running really well with all that extra weight too, with the instincts that he has, and I know it's a devalued position, right, but in kind of an unorthodox top of draft, I think he could really help himself and take himself into that first round conversation.
So the linebacker position is one we haven't talked about a lot this week. And I think that's probably because there's some great linebackers in free agency, like Zach Bond, Dre Greenlaw. It'll be interesting to see how those guys play out. Are there any other linebackers? You mentioned Jalen Walker, who's kind of a hybrid guy. Are there any other linebackers that you think could have an impact like Edgerrin Cooper had on the Packers defense this year?
Yeah, I think Jahad Campbell has the right blend of versatility, size, length, movement skills, and space. I don't think he moves anywhere as near as what Schweschinger does off the ball, but as a guy who's as long as he is, as a guy who's also playing in the 230s, who can get up on the edge a little bit. They moved him around and had some third down impact in that regard. Kind of like a Jalen Walker, but I think he's much better off the ball and can live off ball at the NFL level. I think Jahad Campbell's the one, and you see him in the back half of some first-round mocks. I think he's one that can give you a lot from a run support, block deconstruction, kind of get downhill and attack, but then also have the movement skills to play. And he set up on the podium, his favorite coverage was Tampa 2, because he's like, I like getting back there up the middle because quarterbacks don't think I can run the pole and really protect the seam with speed. And he does have enough of that I think he can bring that to the table at a pretty fair level.
When you attempt to mock draft, what are the teams that you have your hardest time nailing down?
I think Green Bay's a really interesting one in the first round because they have some very apparent needs that intersect with some very apparent tendencies that they have. They like to spend their early draft capital on the defensive side of the ball. What edge players are going to be there if they want somebody to help with Rashawn Gary after Lucas Van Ness hasn't made that leap that they probably had hoped for? But then at corner, we're talking about potentially moving on from Jair Alexander. Eric Stokes hasn't taken the leap as an early draft pick that they made there. So those are two premium positions that you know that team wants to invest in. What's the pecking order like? Is the edge group exhausted that might push them to go for a corner if they like a corner? Like, is that Darian Porter from Iowa State who's going to run really well with a good track background? Does one of the edge guys that has the prototype size fall into their lap? Would they go with a Mike Green as a little bit of a different body type than what they? It's a team that I just really have some hard questions when I look at that roster and I say I can see them. I think I know what they want, but what's available to them because of where they pick in the round makes it kind of tough.
Well, let me follow up about that team specifically because this is one I've had a hard time wrapping my brain around from a wide receiver standpoint.
Yeah.
To me, I've said since like middle of the season that I kind of want them to get like a target earner. I don't think there's a guy available this year in free agency or the draft that necessarily fits what I have in mind for them. So do you have any thoughts about what you think might be available for them in that degree, maybe even later in the draft? Or do you think that this is a year where they kind of punt that and go, yeah, it worked in 2023, like run it back?
Yeah, I think when you add in what they have with Jacobs in the backfield and then the tight end room, can Luke Musgrave stay healthy? Tucker Kraft obviously is a really well-rounded player at the position. I don't think they should force it, but I agree with your thought that, like, man, it'd be really nice to just have like one consistent guy that gets buckets. I think Jaden Reed would be a much more impactful player with consistency if he didn't have to at times be that player for them. So is that I think about body types that would fit for them, and Elik Ayumanor from Stanford, you know, I think he could make some sense as he's going to apparently run really well. He's got good body control. He's got the size that they like, good ball skills down the field for the vertical game that they want to play. Maybe gives you a little bit of a hedge on Christian Watson. Not that I think that he's totally that kind of player, but Watson's just been a really frustrating player to realize his potential. So I think if the price is right, you can maybe go that direction, or a Jack Betch I'd like for them too, is another guy that can get down the vertical plane, but is really physical and can contribute in the blocking game, which obviously no block, no rock for these Shanahan tree offenses, right? They got to earn a little bit. So those are a couple names that come to mind, but the value intersection is the hard part for that, for wide receiver for them.
Yep.
I like that you're talking about the value intersection because I want to take it to the value of the pick itself, sticking with the mock draft. What spots in the draft feel ripe for a team trading down?
That's an interesting one. I just had somebody I was talking to upstairs, and we were just brainstorming about different draft scenarios. And you're starting to hear some buzz about Colston Loveland being a player that teams are higher on than maybe Tyler Warren for the passing game profile. But both of those guys, realistically, you know, tight end's another traditionally devalued position, but if it goes earlier because of some of the holes elsewhere, people like to mock the Colts to a tight end because they've tried repeatedly to replace Mo Alley-Cox, whether it was Kylan Granson or it was Jelani Woods, and then it was Will Mallory. Like, they have tried repeatedly to bring in new bodies to kind of take that tight end spot, and it just hasn't happened. And Tyler Warren's a popular destination pick there. But the teams that are in front, like Dallas or San Francisco or Miami, teams that have kind of been, especially San Francisco and Miami, have been a little bit pick deficient the last, if you look at their 3-year sample size, they could probably really benefit as teams that have a lot of high dollar amount players on their roster. If the top 10 breaks away that they don't like, they would probably love to get some extra draft capital and really stock up. So is it a tight end scenario? Is it Will Johnson that falls outside of the top 10 and, you know, maybe those teams get a corner in free agency and take some of the pressure off to take a Will Johnson? There are a couple different position groups that I look at and say, okay, I could see the Colts being a team that has multiple positions that maybe one of those teams just in front of them would maybe want to get out of.
Okay, so now that we're into specific teams, kind of the flip of the question that I asked earlier about who's the most difficult to mock and nail down, who's the easiest? Who, like, every single time you come, you're at the very least, like, this is the position group.
It's probably Chicago at 10 for me.
Yeah.
Entire interior offensive line group, expiring contracts. The left tackle position, there's been up and down with who they've had there, with Larry Borum and Tevin Jenkins at left guard for them. Offensive line, that feels like the right value, where even if Will Campbell goes, whether it's Armand Membu or whether it's one of the other names, I know Tyler Booker has some big-time fans, even though he's an interior guy. They have to get that right. And when you consider Ben Johnson being the hire there for them and how robust the menu was of what they did on any given week attacking an opposing defense because of the offensive line that they had, he's not going to have that in Chicago at all unless you get real serious real quick about making that a strength on your roster. And it's a blank canvas for them right now. And Trey Smith's getting the franchise tag, so you can cross that one off the board. And that, for me, just makes Chicago, who do I like the best for available offensive linemen to put on the board?
Do they have to cross it off the board, or does this just force their hand to maybe give up a draft pick and push for a tag and trade?
That would be fun. But that's the fun part about this time of year, right?
So
Is you
fun,
get into
right?
the multiverse of outcomes, and you can't really take anything off the table, especially because this is a class where the value teams can view this class maybe as the picks are devalued a little bit. So maybe it makes it even more worth it to go get an established NFL player that you're ready to give a big contract to.
I think it's interesting, though, that you zeroed in on the O-line for the Bears, because I've been hearing people say edge for the Bears. And my brain is like, you have to protect Caleb.
Yeah.
You have to fix that. This is priority number one. I don't know in the same way that, like, Bryce with the guards that they brought in Carolina. I don't know that it's exactly the same, but number one thing is you got to make that look like a good pick this year. So I'm with you.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's specifically there.
Yeah.
You know, especially if it's an interior offensive lineman, that feels high. But
it's early, but what you don't want is the scar tissue to start building up with bad habits, right? And with what last year was, to get him to trust and buy in, even going back to the last year at USC with Lincoln Riley, it was a system he knew well. He didn't trust it. So, like, for me, I'm with you completely that you have to have a supporting cast and an infrastructure that he's willing to trust more than he did last year, even if that means maybe not optimizing that pick from a traditional values perspective.
that's I like the way you said that.
I'm thinking about the discussion of the O-line, and particularly because you were talking about the Shanahan stuff beforehand. And it seems like, I mean, you said it publicly, Kyle Shanahan thinks that he can kind of get away without drafting O-linemen high.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe part of the Stafford stuff, is they've kind of had a lot of turnover in their offensive line. I'm talking about the Los Angeles Rams over the past couple years. Do you think there is any credibility to the idea that you can either wait on the offensive line or fill it in, or do you think the Lions' approach of, no, we're just going to get the best offensive lineman, is the approach to take?
So I think that gives you the largest margin for error, and I think part of the blessing and the curse of that school of thought that the Shanahan tree has is there's so much confidence in the system and pointing the players to trust the system and the coach's ability to call the right play in the right spot because they have supreme confidence in their ability as a play caller to push the right button at the right time at the right point in the script of any given game to make the play call right. I will say I think there is some inherent value of the idea that the sum of the five parts collectively on an offensive line is more important than the sum of the individual parts when you isolate them, because you do have to, as that unit, see the entire picture of a defensive front through the same set of eyes, even though it's 5, sometimes 6 sets of eyes that are all seeing it at once on the field. But that comes from continuity. That's another thing that they like to preach, is getting guys in system, teaching them to stay on their tracks, trust that the back is going to make you right in the run game because you're just going to stay on your track and pick up the first color that arrives in front of your face, and it's the back's responsibility from there to make you right when you're blocking on the front. So I get the ideology, but it's more dummy proof to have a group that has so much talent up front And as we've seen sometimes, whether it's turnover from coaching, whether it's players that are changing on an annual basis, sometimes the continuity that you aspire to have and need to have in order for that ideology to really click, you don't get the chance to have, and then it catches up to you.
Do the Raiders have enough talent on their offensive line and just need to develop that continuity piece, or do you think that they need to maybe make some upgrades this offseason?
I like the core of what they have with Parham and Powers Johnson and Colton Miller. Obviously, they made a pretty decent investment in Glaze at the right tackle spot last year in the draft. I think they have good individual pieces. What I get really excited about with them is that Pete Carroll ideology, early chapters of Russell Wilson, they punched you in the mouth, right? And
Right.
and you know, there's a bunch of different ways that you can run an offense, but I think that leans into the skill sets and the body types of the kinds of players that they have collected. I mean, I didn't even mention Andre James, who I think is a really sturdy center and earned the contract that he got from the Raiders last offseason. So I think they have enough. I have some questions about Glaze at right tackle, but I think that's a group that you can look at Bowers and Mayer. So you can go 12 and get real heavy on folks and really put them in a bind.
Yeah.
With the physical front up front, you need a back to make it count, and then you need a quarterback that can, I don't want to say just keep it between the lines, but I don't think you need top-tier quarterback play to have a competitive NFL offense with what they have around them on the offensive front.
Who is a team that you think has the opportunity to take the biggest leap this year in terms of what they have in front of them with free agency resources, draft resources? Like, for whom are you kind of putting pieces together and going, I think that this one is one that has a good opportunity at least?
Yeah, I don't know that they'll get all the way there this year, but when you have the depth of resources that the New England Patriots have, and you have Mike Vrabel coming in, which I think is a massive upgrade from a coaching standpoint, you have Drake May as a year 2 quarterback who showed a lot of promise. Is that enough of a selling point to get a higher level wide receiver? They've been trying for 2 years, and it feels like they've struck out every chance that they've put themselves out there to go get a big time wide receiver. And I don't know that the market's going to fully cooperate there. But if you told me that this was a team that ended up having a winning record next year, I don't know that I'd be particularly surprised, just because of the upgrading coaching, the year 2 leap for Drake May, $150 billion in cap space. I think it's technically 120 or 124, whatever it is, depending on the new cap floor.
The most.
An exorbitant amount of cap space.
Yep.
And typically, when you have that kind of advantage and you do spend it, you usually see a 4 or 5 game bump in wins off of that. And then if Vrabel does the job that I think he's capable of doing, coming in and establishing what they've aspired to be, that they weren't necessarily at the end of the Belichick era with the personnel misses that kind of added up on them, and then in year 1 with Jerod Mayo, I think that's a team that can be competing for a playoff spot near the end of the year next year. Would not surprise me one bit.
I like how we're going team by team, so I'm going to keep it going. A team who I think has made all the right moves up until now has been the Jaguars. You're bringing in Liam Cohen, who was excellent last year, revived a Tampa Bay Buccaneers running game that was non-existent even when Brady was there. Then you bring in James Gladstone at the general management position from the Rams, who have turned over entire sides of the ball in any one given year. What are your thoughts on their approaches to free agency in the draft?
I think it's interesting because the Gladstone ad, for me, the Rams, for my money, are the best program development in the league right now, as far as the transition that they made from big contracts with Donald and Ramsey and how they added to that defensive side of the ball, and they totally revitalized their offensive line ideology and went out and then they still were willing to draft and add and got a Bo Limmer to make a Jonah Jackson expendable after 1 year when he kind of struggled to stay healthy, and the young talent like Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, so we'll see what Blake Corum ends up being. Like they have done such a phenomenal job, and for Jacksonville to have this quarterback in Trevor Lawrence that you're just really waiting to see some stability, that buzzword around the organization, and to have the reset, I think was the biggest thing, was when they were teetering on the brink of, do we make a GM change at the same time as a head coaching change? Do we wait until after the draft to make the change? I think this was the right move for them. And yeah, they might be getting a little bit of a late start in the process, but to bring that whole school of thought into Jacksonville, which they have talent on both sides. If you look individually at the other side of the ball, they have talent. I think that is a great step for them, and I don't think you have to go crazy, burning a bunch of cash. I think, Gladstone himself talked about this build through the draft ideology. Be patient with it. Let it come to you. You have time because it was a reset. Shad Khan has traditionally been fairly patient with the people running the organization, that the fans have been ready to throw their hands up and be done with for 2 years. So I think they've done a nice job of setting themselves up to really get this thing right here.
Kyle Krabs, where can people find your work?
So I am the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. So we do team building across the league. This is right in my wheelhouse. We love this kind of stuff. And I'm the NFL draft lead for the 33rd team through the end of this draft cycle.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.